Behind where they were working at this moment, digging a ditch for further foundations, there were already might be seen several quite substantial rows of walls, the beginning of Mr. Gaird's Byzantine rotunda and Saxon arch. These walls, now risen to nearly 7 feet high, totally concealed from where the men were working all sight of Chalice Well, for the mayor's London architect, an expert, it turned out, in the mystical intention of compass points, had got the entrance arch facing due east, so that visitors to the well, following in the footsteps of the great Joseph, Agathos de Chaos, as St. John calls him, might approach its waters moving, if they were religious, on their knees, and tapping the grounds with their foreheads in a westerly direction. "Come," said Mr. Gaird now, in a husky, authoritative voice, addressing his daughter, singular, and John. Helped by Sally Lou, he half carried the suffering woman, still keeping up, heedless of where she was, her historical dialogue with her tormentor, over the littered hedge gap and straight among the workmen. Most of the men touched their caps, some went on working, all glanced at the mayor of Glastonbury with that mingled familiarity and respect which he always aroused in the populace. He had come so often to watch them work, and had brought with him so many curious companions, that none of them seemed particularly astonished at the sight of Titty's contorted figure. He directed Sally to prop Mrs. Petherton up for a minute against an overturned wheelbarrow, and then drew the man aside, beckoning John and Crummy to join them. "What I want you three," he said emphatically, but speaking in a quite unexcited, natural voice, "to do for me now, if you will, is to stand in line between here and the well, and not let a soul go up there. No one will probably want to, but if anybody does try, they must be stopped. That's all. If I want you, Crummy, I'll shout, but I probably shan't want anyone. I won't be long. Bless us and keep us." Without any further words, he moved over to the prostrate woman and lifted her up in his arms, holding her pressed against his chest. "He be going to christen she, looks so," said Sally Lou. "Well, missy, I reckon I had best do what he said, but it's sore if me heart to wish poor Bert were I. Thick poor woman would give the eyes out of her head, she's head, to see these grand doings." John was the only one of Mr. Gaird's 3 singular disciples who had the gall to cast a furtive glance over his shoulders to watch the mayor's sturdy, cautious steps as he carried his distracted burden out of sight behind the newly erected masonry. And when the twain had vanished from view, however, he also turned round and took up his sentinel's post. Thus John was standing on the extreme west, Sally on the extreme east, and Crummy in a position that might be called east by south. Here they all three settled themselves to wait, as calmly as they could under the circumstances. It was remarkable how little notice the laboring men, preoccupied with their digging, and anxious to show the mayor's daughter that they were earning their pay, took of their employer's proceedings. John himself, as he watched the motion of these mattocks and spades, felt a queer trance-like feeling steal over his restless mind. His gaze, traveling over the stooping backs of the men on the level ground and over the heads and swinging picks of those working at the ditches, noted, in this curious dreamlike numbness of his senses, so alert a few minutes ago, that a flock of sheep was being driven up the road. These woolly creatures, packed close together, but raising in the damp, windless air no cloud of dust, and much less that usual of their accustomed bleating, were moving in mass, like a river of gray, curly wool, eastward, away from the town. 3 figures, a man, a boy, and a sheepdog, as gray and woolly as the flock itself, walked patiently and somnambulely behind them. Somnambulely behind them. As he watched these figures in that moving river of greybacks in front of them, his mind was carried away upon a long vista of memories. Various roads where he had encountered some such sights, some of them in Norfolk, some of them in France, came drifting through his mind, and with those memories came a queer feeling that the whole of his life was but a series of such dream pictures, and that the whole series of these pictures was something from which, as he made a strong enough effort, he could awake, and feel them all dispersing like wisps of vapor. I too now am imagining all the times I've seen sheep in my life, in Ireland, around here. Anyway, pain was real. That woman eyeing out upon her cancer and calling it, Lord, Lord! But even pain, and all the other indescribable horrors of life seemed, as he stared at the backs of those moving sheep, to be made of a stuff, as Shakespeare calls it, that could be compelled to yield, to loosen, to melt, to fade, under the right pressure. Sort of like a Zen guy here. Gone were the sheep now, and a second later, following them in that same dreamlike movement, gone was the man, and the boy, and the dog. John's mood changed then, with an abrupt jerk. Something in his mind seemed to fall with a machine-like click into a normal groove. Slyly he turned round and glanced at Crummy. The girl had slipped off her cloak, spread it on the ground, and was sitting with part of it wrapped around her knees. She waved to him as he caught her attention, and he waved back. None of these workmen had the least desire to spy upon the master. Bloody Johnny was at liberty to perform any crazy ritual he liked behind those walls. I might just as well be sitting by Crummy's side, he thought. He peered round the other way to see what the taxi man was doing. Sally Lou only was sitting down, on a stone or a log or something, calmly smoking his pipe and contemplating the workmen. But John's imagination was at work now. What on earth was Gerd doing to that woman? Most repulsively, for John's mind had a Goya-like twist for the monstrous, he saw his employer dipping that poor creature in his precious chalybeate water. Chalybeate water. He saw the scene with the hideous and telescopic minuteness. He saw the filthy saw the filthy underwear, not underwater, filthy underwear of the poor wretch, unchained for a week, no doubt, while she beat the nurse away, and all stained with ordure. He saw vermin frightened by the water, leaving her clothes and scurrying away across the slabs of the fountain, where they would undoubtedly perish miserably. He saw the loathsome image of the cancer itself. Gerd was bathing it in that reddish water and muttering his grotesque invocations, while the woman, John could see her face, was terrified into forgetting her pain by the cold shock of the water. No doubt it had come into her simple mind that the mayor had decided to rid Glastonbury of her. John's imagination, after being so dazed by the sheep, was now seized with a terrifying clairvoyance. He followed one of Titty's vermin in its flight from Bloody Johnny's vigorous ablutions. As he saw it encountering a lusty wood louse, while he had to turn itself into a leader-colored ball to avoid Mr. Gerd's feet, but which... let me read that part again. And he saw it encountering a lusty woodlouse, which had to turn itself into a letter-colored ball to avoid Mr. Gerd's feet, but which, appearing now in the other path like an immense brontosaurus, had uncurled itself to the view of the human louse. All is strange to me, said the human louse to the wood louse. He spoke the lice language with its beautiful vowel sounds to perfection. On the contrary, said the wood louse, speaking the same ancient tongue, but with a rude rural intonation. You are the only strange thing here to see, to me. Could you direct me? The human louse inquired, giving its words a classical resonance indicative of the fact that two ancestors had lived with the Romans. To any human skin in this vicinity? The woodlouse rudely disabused this dainty traveler of his high hope, and reported that the only skin except the bark of trees available to them in that quarter was the skin of a rabbit that had been caught in a trap a year ago. Nothing can save you from dying of starvation that I can see, said the woodlouse, except to be discovered by some bird small enough to snap you up. If you like, I will pass the word round that you are in such a mental anguish that... Here the story John had told himself broke off, but he continued thinking about the monstrous arrogance of the human race in lumping together in one clumsy and ridiculous word, instinct, 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 all the turbulent drama, full of crisscross psychic currents and convoluted struggles and desperations of the subhuman world. The thought of the luckless fate of that miserable vermin and the unchanged clothes of this rebel against Nurse Robinson brought into John's mind just then, under that heavy sky, the real ghastliness of the word relative. It's relatively important that those vermin should escape starvation, he thought. It's relatively important that Garrett should have his miracle. It's relatively important that this wretched woman should be eased in her pain. It's relatively important that my life with Mary should be exquisitely happy. It's relatively important that this grave as Philip should be, that this grave ass Philip should get the town council's leave to make his road over this marches. God, what a mix-up it all is. I don't care. I don't make the world. I'm not responsible. There could be a sweeter creature than Mary. No, not for Glastonbury, to Jerusalem. There could not be. I'm sorry, I'm missing like every other word here today. While these thoughts were passing through John's mind, Mr. Garrett, stark naked in the Grail fountain, the water off which came up beyond his waist, and watched by the petrified astonishment of Titty, who reclined with her back against the base of the Saxon arch, was extending his arm in some sort of command. John was utterly wrong in his imagination. Not once did Mr. Garrett call upon the blood of Christ. Not once did he sprinkle with the blood-red water the woman with cancer. Mr. Garrett's clothes lay in a neat heap at Titty's side, and the woman, in stupefied amazement, was watching him uplifted fingers as they kept mechanically opening and closing in the tempest of his mental struggle. Mr. Garrett was not praying. That was the difference between the occasion and the other occasions when his therapeutic powers had been used. He was not praying. He was commanding. If the questions were asked, what precisely was Mr. Garrett thinking and feeling as he lifted his arms from the red fountain, the answer would have had to be that he was assuming to himself the role of a supernatural being. As a matter of literal fact, such were the childish limitations of this singular man's nature, Mr. Garrett had, for 1 second, visualized himself a picture in the Sunday school at Montacute, representing our Lord in the process of being baptized in the Jordan. There was no conscious blasphemy in this flickering thought, and it had not lasted. Now he was neither thinking nor feeling. Now his whole body and soul were absorbed in an act. This act was the act of commanding the cancer to come out of this woman, commanding it on his own authority, so that the growth of Titty's side should wither up. The truth is that this chalybeate fountain, chalybeate? I don't know how to pronounce it, on this particular hillside, had been the scene of such a continuous series of mystic rites going back to the Neolithic men of the Lake Village, if not to the still more mysterious race that preceded them, that there had come to hang about it a thick aura of magical vibrations. That rabbit skin on the trap, referred to by John's woodlouse, might lose its virtue owing to rain and frost and bleaching sun, but this psychic aura, charged with the desperate human struggles of 5,000 years to break into the arcana of life, No rain could wash away. No sun could dry up. No frost could kill. And that's our Glastonbury story for today. I'll see you next time in Glastonbury. Cheers.